The disunity of Africa is big business. And if we forget that, we will once again be manipulated. It's not lost on me last year that one of the themes of African Union was the silencing of the guns by the year 2020. I'm not a Jewish prophet, but the guns will not be silent next year. Time has come that Africa must define herself. One of the problems that we have in Africa is that we do not define ourselves.
If you're just joining this YouTube channel, please subscribe and don't forget to ring the notification bell so that you get our new video anytime we drop a new video on this channel. And I hope you will enjoy watching this video.
In the month of May 1963, the leaders of the then independent African countries assembled in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And many speeches were delivered, and the thrust of all the speeches was that African countries, having regained their independence, their primary focus and objective was to ensure that they exercise their regained mandate for the benefit of the people, to ensure that the people were liberated from ignorance, disease, and poverty. On the 24th day of May, perhaps the most powerful speech ever made by an African leader, Kwame Nkrumah. And he reminded the leaders who were present on that day about a number of things. One, he told them that not to delude themselves that by regaining their independence, the erstwhile colonizer would recoil and remain inactive. That in fact, the erstwhile colonial master was going to be more pernicious, but in a very subtle way. Kwame Nkrumah was right. He reminded his audience that going forward it was necessary and indeed urgent that Africans should begin to think as one whole, because if they remained in disunity, they would remain weak and vulnerable and therefore susceptible to manipulation. Kwame Nkrumah was right. I remind us of this particular incident 58 years ago because in 2013, the African Union came with Agenda 2063. And if you look at the text of Agenda 2063 and the speeches that were given around it, it was the rehash of what Kwame spoke about and the other leaders spoke about. One of the themes of African Union was the silencing of the guns by the year 2020. I'm not a Jewish prophet, but the guns will not be silent. In fact, there are more guns that are emerging in Africa, which means that peace is still very elusive. And then the conceptual West convinced us that our salvation could only come from something they call democracy. And I'm using the word very deliberately, something they call democracy, which they defined. And they defined it in English, defined it in French, defined it in Portuguese, and they defined it in Spanish if you are colonized by the Spaniard. We never defined it in Kinyarwanda. No. It was never defined in Igbo or Yoruba. And we were told after the collapse of the Soviet Union that democracy was equals to 1, multi-party politics, 2, periodic elections, 3, limitation of terms of the presidency. That is how the conceptual West defined it for us. So when we define democracy, we are also caught up in this box. Sometimes we tell ourselves to think outside of the box, but the true north of our thought processes still remains the box. We never think without the box. When we talk about peace in Africa and we talk about adversarial politics, we are not talking about anything that is African. The political party is not African. It is something that we inherited because the thesis still is that you divide them in order to rule them. That is the thesis. We don't say it as loudly as we should because we want to be politically correct, and I refuse to be correct. And this is exactly what Kwame Nkrumah warned us about. We'll be persuaded to form outfits. And in many African countries, these outfits are formed on the basis of ethnic affiliation. Your typical African political party is simply an assembly of ethnicities. And in many African nations, you will discover that what we call elections is simply an ethnic census to determine which ethnic group is larger than the other. And that is why, therefore, when you look at Africa today, you discover that after every election cycle in many African countries, there is conflict. Because you go into the election, or the political parties go into an electoral process on the basis that we must win, and if we don't win, the elections have been rigged. In other words, we place so much premium on the presidency, and you'll see in many African countries, entry into government is like winning a lottery. It is winning a lottery because it gives you access to resources. And therefore people claim the president. If you are in a country, you say, and one of your own means a son. They are normally sons. One of your own sons has won the presidency. The tribe celebrates, from the herdsman to the professor, from the fisherman to the intellectual, because we have now won the presidency. We have won the lottery. We will have ministers. We'll have all these, and everybody else feels excluded, and that generates conflict. People want to be included. In such a scenario, my verdict is, number one, Africa's long-term salvation demands that we avoid adversarial politics. Africa's salvation demands that we define for ourselves what democracy means. And you said it very correctly, Professor, and the good friend from the United Kingdom, very correctly. What people want is to participate. What people want is to have a government that is accountable. Many people in many African countries simply want food on the table. Many people in many African countries simply want to have access to healthcare. Many people simply want good education. Young men and women in Africa simply want opportunities for innovation and invention. And they want a government that creates an environment where that can be achieved. And therefore, in my view, I think that time has come that Africa must define herself. One of the problems that we have in Africa is that we do not define ourselves. And permit me to annoy you. In many African nations today, after every election, whether we like it or not, we have observers. And when the elections are being held, observers may come from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Uganda, but people are waiting. What did the European Union say? You know, this belief by us that the Europeans have a divine duty to tell us what to do, and we have a divine duty to accept to do what they say, is one of the problems that we have. And until the day that we liberate ourselves to decolonize our minds, in a manner of speaking, we are going to embrace the kind of politics that will only perpetuate conflict. Right now, as I move towards my conclusion, I simply want you to look at the map of Africa. And look at the map of Africa against the declaration that the guns might be silenced by 2020. And simply tell me, is there peace and calm in Niger? Is there peace and calm in Burkina Faso? Do you have peace and calm in Mali? Is it peaceful in Mauritania? Is it peaceful in Benin? Is it peaceful in Gabon? Is it peaceful in Cameroon? Is it peaceful in South Sudan? Is it peaceful in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Is it peaceful in Somalia? You look at the map of Africa and you look at that, and you are being told through declarations that we are going to silence the guns in 2020. It's as if you are being told to go to Kigali, and meanwhile you have engaged a gear taking you to the Democratic Republic of Congo's border, and you are on jet-like speed. This is why I think that it is incumbent upon us to remember one thing, that peace is not merely the absence of war. It is much deeper than that. That development is not building of skyscrapers in African cities, no. And that therefore, if we want to sustain peace and development, what we must look at are the human indices. I think the Bhutanese have got it right. What they call the gross national happiness index. These things that Europe tells us many useful things, but there are certainly useless things that they tell us. One of them is the thing called per capita income. That they take all the wealth, half of which is owned by 2 people, and then they divide it and say the per capita income is $800. And meanwhile, all other people are suffering. I'm submitting to us that time has come that we must define what development is. I want to go to a typical Rwandese village, and beyond peace, beyond the absence of war, I want to see peace at the dinner table. I want to see peace at the hospital and the dispensary. And I'm suggesting to us that politics defines all these. And one of the things that we must do, and Professor, I can't agree with you more, is that there is no one size fits all. There is no one size fits all. What works for Rwanda is not necessarily what works for Uganda. Ethnicities are real. And if we continue to delude ourselves in Africa that ethnicities are unreal, we are cheating ourselves. Even the United States of America nowadays, when you hear them talking about the vote, they talk about the Hispanic vote. They talk about the black vote. They talk about the Caucasian vote. They are beginning to recognize that those blocks are critical. How then do you use them in a manner that is positive? Because look at the Democratic Republic of Congo with over 233 ethnicities. Look at Nigeria with over 200 languages. Look at Kenya with over 56. Look at Tanzania with 136 plus. These are the realities in the African nation. And I am convinced that going forward, number one, we need to have peace. But we will not have peace by declaring that peace will come and reign. We must do things that move us in the direction of attaining peace. And until we introduce what I've called elsewhere hygiene in our politics, we are moving nowhere. And part of the introduction of hygiene is to recognize the environment and the context in which we operate in. One of the areas in which we must move is to recognize that going forward, we are different nations in single states trying to create mega nations. And unless we have inclusivity so that people feel they belong. And I'm suggesting to us that politics must be of such a nature that allows ethnicities and groups to negotiate. I do not as yet have an answer which I think I can pin on the ground, but I have the following things: that it cannot be uniform, that it must be specific to the circumstances of each country, that it is us who must define it, and that we must have a vocabulary for it, and that we must warn ourselves that the erstwhile colonial master is alive and well, subterranean and pernicious to the core. Don't delude yourselves. And remember that sometimes the disunity of Africa is big business. And if we forget that, we will once again be manipulated.